all sitting comfortably. Good morning. That's not bad. That's not bad, actually. Good morning. That's better. You see, that's what I was expecting from Jakarta. You know, I often find that, you go around the world, you turn up to these conferences, you just get this. So, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here. As I said, my name's Jason Pomeroy. Professors tend to have grey hair and shoulder patches on jackets. I like to buck from that trend. I'm the host of a TV series called City Time Traveller. There are 3 people who watch that show. It's my mother, my wife, and my baby daughter. Blatant plug. Let's just pick up the viewing audiences. It's interesting that Greg was mentioning about this almost antithesis between kind of the haves and the have-nots in that image in Brazil, and also that sort of photo montage between Dharavi and Tokyo and Barcelona. And I've just recently spent a few days filming in Manila for season 2 of the City Time Traveller. Another plug, by the way. And interestingly enough, Intramuros, which was a Spanish colonial walled town, was a place of elite. I mean, it was effectively where all the governmental buildings were, all the religious and civic institutions. But over time, it has adapted to the pressures of urbanization and population increase. And what we're seeing is this almost organic growth within the city walls. And it's something that a global city is having to deal with. And I think this conversation that we're going to have in this living room, it's a bit like a living room, isn't it? I mean, we've got sort of comfy chairs, and I have to say, you all look so prim and proper. I mean, this is almost like our TV set. Welcome to our living room. These are my wonderful guests in the living room. What we're going to do is have a conversation, a very, very informal one. And there's going to be a lot of backwards and forwards. Any questions from the audience? If you don't mind, we'll leave it to the end, because we're going to be watching the TV and having our own sort of informal chat. Now, as Greg was pointing out, I mean, we are faced with cataclysmic changes, social, economic, environmental, spatial, cultural, and technological. When I just think about the fact that half the world's population has been living in inner city centres since 2007, the fact that by 2050, 75% of those are actually going to be living in the city centres. We're seeing incredible transmigration into the city. We're also seeing spatial depletion. We're seeing the open spaces that were once so intrinsic for our social interaction. Going to grab a coffee before LinkedIn and YouTube. We're seeing the gradual eradication of those open spaces that were once good for our interaction. We're seeing record-breaking droughts and floods, all part of climate change and the issues that go along with climate change that also need to be addressed. There are also, though, technological advances, and so I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about those technological advances in order to kind of make our day-to-day lives so much easier in cities. We're also faced with globalization and the adoption of particular cultures around the world. What does it mean to be Indonesian? What does it mean to be Singaporean? What does it mean to be a Brit somewhere in Asia? And also the burgeoning global economies, whether locally, how do they actually adapt to the winds of change? Now, the social, economic, environmental, spatial, cultural, and technological parameters is something that we're going to be discussing, and we'll see how we can be seizing this urban moment. Now, I'd like to introduce this fine selection. First of all, sitting to my immediate left is Reuben Abraham, Chief Executive Officer and Senior Fellow of the IDFC Institute. Now, he's a pretty sharp cookie. Dr. Reuben Abraham is CEO and Senior Fellow at the IDFC Institute, a think tank set up by India's largest infrastructure finance company. And I don't know, it must be some something in the water and something about New York today, because we heard Greg mentioning New York, and you're also, from what I see, a non-resident scholar at New York's University Stern School of Business. We also have Tuty Kusumawati. Please excuse my pronunciation. I really do need to sort of, brush up on my Bahasa Indonesia. Ms. Kusumawati is the current head of Regional Development Planning Board of Jakarta Capital City and has the immense task of being the responsible for coordinating Jakarta's development and planning, the operational research and development, as well as the statistical matters associated with the capital city. And then, I guess, a giant of technology and innovation, we have Michel Crochon, who I believe is replacing Chris Leong. But we're very, very privileged to have Michel here. He is the Executive Vice President in charge of global strategy. And since 2014, Michel has been leading global strategy and technology for Schneider Electric. And finally, right at the end there, we have Peggy Liu, Chairperson, Joint US-China Collaboration on Clean Energy, a non-profit organization for accelerating the greening of China and an expert in China's clean energy landscape. And not only that, she was formerly a McKinsey consultant and a venture capitalist in Shanghai. Is there anything more you could possibly do? How on earth do you juggle your times? Quite remarkable. So first of all, a round of applause for the panelists, please. Now, I'm conscious all the water's at this end of the table. Do you want to grab yourself a glass of water? Because we are at home in the living room, and you are going to be watching a bit of TV. And if we can probably get another glass up here, because I'm absolutely parched. I am really going to keel over at any moment now. So, starting off the proceedings, I would really like to kind of focus the first question to Reuben. Now, when we kind of think about cities as centers of trade and commerce, historically born out of trade and commerce taking places by rivers and seas, what we can see over the centuries is that you have the developed cities and the developing cities, almost a bit like a English Premier League. You've got the sort of the ones who are excelling and the ones that are trying to break into that new position. So what sort of, what does it take to make for a successful developed cities, and what do we need to do to try and ensure that these developing economies can be competitive?
Jason, given everything that's happened over the last 2 months, I'm surprised you still bring up the English Premier League.
Well, you know.
I think football fans should gravitate towards where I am and watch the Spanish League instead.
You disappoint me already.
The Bundesliga. Thank you very much to the City of Jakarta and to the NewCities Foundation for being such great hosts. I think it's an interesting question that you ask, and so this is pretty much the story of urbanization, which is that until now, the story of urbanization has been primarily one of developed countries that have urbanized. And the story for the next 50 years is going to be that of developing countries urbanizing. And again, if you just do some rough extrapolations of numbers that are quickly available, over the next 35 years, you'll have about 2.6 billion people urbanizing in the developing world, and about 170 million people urbanizing in the developed world. And I think that number is extremely important to keep in mind, because this is fundamentally urbanization over the next 35 years is a developing country problem. But before I go any further there, I think it's also important to realize when we sit around in a room like this, which is basically full of cities enthusiasts, I don't need to preach to you about why cities are important. I mean, most of us in this room actually believe that, otherwise we wouldn't be in this room. But keep in mind the fact that that is not a given. In November, I was basically leading a panel with a whole bunch of African heads of state. And of the 5 heads of state on the panel, there was exactly one, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who was actually a city enthusiast. The rest of them were actually all firmly of the opinion that people should remain in rural areas and so on. So going back to Greg's point about the right to a city, I think that is something that we need to actually build on and make the case for why cities are important. Now, having said all of that, let's also think about what makes a great city. And I'm a big technology enthusiast, but I think we should be very careful not to put the cart before the horse. And so therefore concentrate on what is it that made New York so great, or what is it that made Barcelona so great. And when you go to that set of issues, it is actually starting with rule of law. And we mustn't forget these things. I mean, crime, controlling crime. You know, the reason why, if you look at a place like Detroit, it's spun out of control. Installing a bunch of sensors in Detroit is not going to solve the problem. There's another set of issues in Detroit that are at play. So similarly, one shouldn't forget about governance issues. One shouldn't forget about rule of law issues. And also be careful that we don't fall into what Al Hirschman described as the exit trap, which is when the middle class and the elite class basically exit the system because we've privatized all the public goods. We've privatized our security, we've privatized our water supply, we've privatized everything. And so then we believe that none of these issues actually matter. It matters a lot because cities are primarily for the poor. It's not so much for the rich. So therefore, if I were to sort of rebrand the whole idea of smart cities, I would rebrand it as doing smart things in cities rather than smart cities.
So you're basically saying that the success of these sort of developed cities and the go-to cues for these developing cities is actually all about governance, rule of law, policy making, and in that case, in that case, that allows me to have a quick chat with Tuty about that, because what you're saying is also the steps that you've actually taken for the city of Jakarta has been to actually look at more open data policies, practices within the Jakarta government to actually allow the city to succeed. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Firstly, I would like to share about our level of local government. We have provincial level here, the governor govern at provincial level. After provincial level, we have 5 cities and 1 regency. 1 regency called Pulau Seribu mean 1,000 island, but actually there are only 110 islands, but we call it 1,000 islands. And after that, we have 44 districts, and after district level, we have 267 sub-districts level, 4 levels of local government inside Jakarta government, and then we meet community at grassroots level. So the planning process goes both direction, top-down and bottom-up direction. Of course, we also have to talk in a horizontal level with our neighborhood cities and regencies around Jakarta, and also taken into account the policy from central government. And the processes is now, as Reuben said, we do smart work. We have to do smart work. Can you imagine for 10 million people, citizens of Jakarta, then we have to listen to them personally, but then we come to them by system, and also we come to them with technology, with a smart way. And we are doing planning from it's a bottom-up processes started from community level. We call it, we use a method of sort of a crowdsourcing method of community association level. And then from community association level, the proposed activities goes to our first frontliner level of government, that is sub-district level. Discuss there and also recheck to the field and took photograph using technology by GPS basis, and then we check the location, and the location will go to our website system at Smart City Jakarta. And if it's approved, then the activity will be accepted. If it is by reason rejected, so we will reject the proposed activities. Also, there is also one option, probably if there is not enough sources, the activities could be postponed for the next year budget. This is the processes from bottom up. We also have top-down policy, of course, as Governor or Mr. Governor mentioned. We have a very large scale infrastructures project in Jakarta. Recently, Pak Governor launched the LRT, adding up our previous huge infrastructure for MRT. LRT is will be built in a basis of what we call not underground. What you call elevated LRT along alignment. There will be 7 corridors all over Jakarta for LRT. That's for top-down MRT, LRT, and also other big infrastructures. We also invite, of course, investors for PPP scheme to build and to develop Jakarta. As Pak Governor mentioned, for kid-friendly open space, it is a kind of PPP scheme. We provide the land, we provide the open space, the location, the space, but then private sectors doing CSR there, building the equipment, building the library, provide sport corners for youth, and also provide some educational tools for children, for women, etc. there at our current smart park, as Governor mentioned.
I'd like to pick up on what you're talking about there relating to kind of open spaces and smart parks. And what we find with that population increase and inner city migration is that these open spaces become somewhat of a challenge. And when you look at some of those successful developed economies and their cities that have an abundance of open spaces that are good for people to go and interact, I would like to see what are the kind of the challenges facing governments in order to try and incorporate these open spaces. Back to you, Reuben. I mean, when you're looking at the growth of these cities, and you know that there are all these pressures to house so many more individuals moving into the cities, how can you ensure that you strike that balance between housing the many, but at the same time preserving open space for everybody's enjoyment?
Sure. So I mean, you know, I go back to one of my favorite examples, which is the Manhattan Grid. And I mean, people forget that 200 years ago, a bunch of extraordinarily far-sighted individuals created the grid of Manhattan. And what they really were doing was they were reserving public space. And the public space that they reserved was basically the arterial grid of Manhattan, onto which you could pretty much 70 years later plonk Central Park on to the grid, kind of thing. So I think it's imperative to mark off public space in any plan that you build in up-and-coming cities. And then comes the law and order question, which is, yes, you've reserved the space for public space, but can it hold? Does your rule of law system ensure that what is reserved for public space will remain public, right? So that's one set of issues. On the affordability issue, again, you know, I can certainly speak from the Indian example, where if you look at the demand for housing today, something between 95 and 99% of all demand comes from low-income households. But if you look at supply of housing, about 95% of supply is basically aimed at either high middle income or the rich. That's where the supply is basically. And a lot of this has been caused by an extraordinarily ill thought out policy environment, where, for instance, your approvals processes can take up to 2 years. There's absolutely no mortgage financing available for low-income housing. So what that basically means is that you are basically building affordable housing, but you will have to wait 18 to 24 months to get an approval. Now, if your cost of capital is about 15 to 18%, which is what it is, people in the business people in the room know that you will no longer be building affordable housing, but you'll be building condos. So the entire mechanism, the public policy mechanism, needs to actually reflect the fact that the city needs to house the poor, and needs to house the poor in something other than slums. So again, going back to what Singapore did with the HDB and so on, these are policy responses and needs to be extraordinarily well thought out.
Yes, yes. Michel, I'd like to kind of ask you about the impact of digitization here, because one big frustration on my part is that I want to go into a park and I want to enjoy the space and I want to be able to kick a ball around with, you know, with my child. And what do I see? I see people glued to their phones. They're glued to their iPhones. They're doing selfies, doing Lord knows what else with their technology. So how do you actually interface that element of digitization and technology and still safeguard the open spaces that are so intrinsic to the success of our cities? After all, these are the lungs of our city. We can actually breathe, we can sort of interact with others. Surely we don't want to be just stuck on our phones all day long.
Okay, thank you. Before coming to your precise question, I want to say a few words about the way we see a smart city from a business point of view, and I will make several times a comparison between our business and the smart city challenge, because I think there is more and more a shared vision that we need to move, obviously. At the end, it will come with IoT, digitization, and all this stuff. But it's a journey. It's a journey because at the end of the day, the main obstacle is us, the mindset of the people, the mindset of the citizen, and it's a change management, it's a journey going through digitization and IoT, obviously. And we need to go to this result by transforming everything we do, by using more digital means, resources, and etc. Take our example, we're in relation with customers. So the first thing we do is to digitize the relation with our customers. So first thing we do, we could digitize the relation with the citizen before inventing fancy new things. The second thing we do is digitize our company. So we can digitize a little bit the city inside. And then by proving and walking the talk, we'll be able to digitize and help this famous sales phone to bring new services. And I will come later on how we can foster innovation. We have a lot of examples, small examples, that we need to spread out, obviously, to show out how by innovation, collaboration, the second key word, because alone we cannot do anything in this new world. Collaboration between cities and businesses, inside the cities, between businesses, because none of us is able to bring this. So the glue will be digitization around this, but we need to share the vision. The main message here is to say almost 95% of the technology is ready. So I can bring a very big word saying the business model has to be refined, the metrics has to be established, the financing has to be chosen. We can go from CapEx to OpEx economy, obviously, we know all these kind of things. But the main obstacle is us making this transformation journey and making this happening. I was last week or 10 days ago in Europe, and I was in Oslo or in Paris. There are a lot of meetings around environment preparation of the COP21 in those days, and I see a lot of convergence of all the people saying we need to move, we need to move. And as we say sometime and everywhere, when there is a will, there is a way.
Are we just getting a bit too smart for our own good? I mean, technology can also be, it can cause us just as many problems as they are, solving some of those issues. I mean, once upon a time, here we are, caveman, cavewoman, sitting at the mouth of a cave, enjoying natural light, natural ventilation. We discover fire. We move deeper inside the cave. We've been vanishing deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper inside the cave because of technology. And isn't that actually just causing some of the issues that we face today? 50% of our carbon emissions are caused by the built environment, of which 80% of that 50%. So how can we start tackling these sort of issues relating to our carbon emissions? Peggy, I'd like to kind of ask you that in particular, because you're involved with clean energy. China is one of the biggest producers of carbon dioxide emissions. So what are the challenges that you're facing, and how can we be sort of reducing our carbon footprint within cities? Is it through technology? Is he your ally? Or actually, should we be sort of taking a bit of a cautious step to just embracing every technology possible just to satiate our own needs?
I feel like that's a topic for a completely different panel. I have an hour-long talk about just climate change and then an hour-long talk about reduction of coal.
So you can give it a go, I'm sure.
But let me give you a little bit of context in terms of what's happening in China through the lens of our work, JUCCCE, in China since 2007. So I'm a professor at something called the China Academy of Governance. This is one of the academies that teaches the senior officials across China, and we teach how to build cities sustainably. And we've been doing this since 2008 at the request of the Vice Minister of Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development. We teach across 3 of the 8 academies. And what I find fascinating is that since 2008, as we've taught almost 1,000 officials so far, that the sophistication of Chinese officials has gotten increasingly, well, it's gone from, what is an eco-city to some of the more sophisticated people around the world in terms of how to actually develop innovations at a city level. In terms of China, I think that a lot of people don't understand how the mandatory training system works and how influential that is at the urban level. So I just want to take a minute to explain how that works. If you're an official in China above a certain level, you have to take 12 days of training each year. It's a mandatory training. It's like getting your driver's license reissued each year. If you're being promoted, then you might take up to 3 months or a year to train at some of these academies. So these academies, at least they claim that it's the reason why China has undergone harmonious growth since the last 30 years. I think most of the people in this room understand the context of what's happening in China, but again, I'll take a brief 30 seconds to talk about what's happening in China, what our urban moment looks like. Our urban moment is 40 years long, and we're about 25 years into it. Over the next 15 years, we'll probably have another 300 million people move into Chinese cities. We'll have at least 75% of the population live in cities. 40% of cities will be migrant workers, so it'll be very interesting to see how we have an inclusive city, how we build an inclusive city, not just a smart city. We'll build 170 new mass transit systems, 100 new airports, maybe 50,000 new skyscrapers. So for me, what's really interesting is that China is undergoing this urban moment, but it's going at it at such a large scale and such a fast pace. So I think that China is probably the only country that's really innovating at a large scale, at a city scale. And to me, that's really exciting from a clean energy point of view, from a tech point of view, because all of these technologies are fairly new, and to commercialize them, to make them affordable for all countries, not just for China, we need to commercialize them quickly and at large scale. We need economies of scale. And we can do that in China if we can learn how to better collaborate with companies, not just within China, but from around the world, with city to city. And I think China right now is struggling with that layer of collaboration. How do we actually bring in technologies? China's not very good at radical innovation, but we're very good at tweakivation. But we need to look at these technologies in a more holistic way at a city level through the lens of nexus issues. And China is not very good at that. We are very siloed in culture. So for me, China is very interesting as it's moved from a factory of the world to the clean tech laboratory of the world to the sort of city laboratory of the world now. And so to me, I'm very optimistic about the future of our urban moment in China.
So we certainly see, incredible progress, and we see economic prosperity and this rapid urbanization in China. And you would lay the success of that because of silos, or actually the fact that there has been this burgeoning collaboration?
I think success is number one because of this mandatory training system.
Yeah.
So, for example, we have our class might be made of 50 mayors or 50 mayors and central government officials, and they're there for 2 weeks, right? So they really dive down into specific subjects. So if they signed up for sustainable urbanization class, they really want to learn.
Okay.
I think that the other thing is that a lot of people think about China as a communist country, especially from America. They might think of it as a Russian communism or a German communism, but actually all that doesn't really exist anymore. It's more, China's run more like a multinational corporation.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Peggy. When we think about sort of collaboration, there is still that sense of people working in silos, groups, associations working in silos. Michel, how do you think we could be breaking down those silos? How can we sort of foster a greater sense of collaboration?
I think, again, collaboration is key to everything, to a lot of things. And it's a three-dimensional collaboration seen by me because as a company, as a business, I cannot offer everything to make a smart city, to make a city smarter. I need to collaborate with other businesses, to IT companies, and etc. The second level of collaboration, I've experienced this in in a project we have been doing with the Hong Kong city called Y City. There is a big need of collaboration between the department of the city itself, which is, as a company, as a business, very siloed as well. So, and the third type of collaboration we need, this collaboration between the private and the public sector, obviously, for a shared vision. So this is what we call a collaboration. But at the end of the day, collaboration is again a change of mindset. And it's very difficult because we want to know everybody wants to know its scope and to manage its own perimeter. It's not possible anymore. So we need to have a shared vision, and the shared vision is happening because there is a real need. We are speaking about this CO2 reduction need. And then when you collaborate, you need to understand that you give one day to somebody that will give you back another day. So it's a different type of spirit, but it works, and it works. But you need a vision, you need some drive, you need leadership, and then you implement. And you can implement small scale, and then enlarge, go step by step, but always with the same direction.
I guess once upon a time, for these great cities, you'd have the grand patron who basically look towards an architect and basically say, right, I want this, go and make it happen. But I guess increasingly, the creation of cities in the 21st century has become more and more complex and needs so many different stakeholders, so many different specialists. How do you start by actually bringing this rich melange of individuals? How do you start bringing the various people together and work collectively? I mean, that must be a huge headache.
From what we see, you have two levels of experiences, and you are right mentioning architects, because when you take a new city, you need to have the global layout and the global organization, the buildings, the flows of the people, the transportation, and etc. So you need to have a global frame, and you have a few projects like this in the world that are very ambitious and very difficult, but at the same time, you have a lot of mid-size or even small cities that start addressing the smart city problem, and they have to start, or they start, generally speaking, by addressing the energy saving in the building, or they start by addressing the traffic issue in their roads, and it's also smart city. So you have the big smart city, what we call lighthouses type of projects, and you have the day-to-day smart city or major challenges, and that starts with these two pillars that one day you can integrate in a bigger frame. So we need to do both at the same time, because having only new cities created from scratch everywhere, no, we need to take the existing basis, because obviously we are going to build as many cities in the next 40 years as we build since ever, but we need also to address the present, what we call existing basis, existing cities, and to make them smarter, because at the end of the day, this is where the citizens are.
Indeed, Peggy.
Can I say that one thing that I think we've learned in China is that you can't just have an architect or clean energy or energy efficient experts look at infrastructure. Yeah. McKinsey started something called the Urban China Initiative with Tsinghua in Colombia a few years ago, and they do something every year called the Sustainable Cities Index. And last year they found something interesting, which is after a city reaches 4 million people, you really have to work to think and design the city services into something. It doesn't just organically grow better anymore. And so I think that for the smart cities concept, I think, I'm all for it. I'm an engineer by training, so I love technology, but I think that what China really needs is to think beyond smart city to livable cities, right? Eco-livable cities. And the problem with that is that that livability happens between developments, not just in developments, right? It's the space between buildings, not just the energy efficiency of a building. It's not just about the grid or the infrastructure around you. It's about the glue. So I think when we talk about collaboration, what we're trying to do in China as we push this concept of eco-livability is to bring in, cast a much wider net. So think about, what does culture of a city mean? Right? It's not just about sustainable city anymore. It's much wider. So then you need to bring in the movie people. You need to bring the different types of visual storytellers. You need to bring in the artists and the museum people. You need to really think about what what does culture mean? How do we make a space vibrant, have a soul? Right? I think a lot of people here are experts about a sense of place and things like that. So I think that's the interesting discussion.
I buy that. I completely get that. But here you have this situation where you are sometimes faced with developers turning around saying, do you know what, I've just come back from my trip to Venice. Absolutely brilliant. I want to recreate a bit of Venetian culture here in my city. And what I think we're finding is increasingly you get this sort of ability to kind of pick something up from one part of the world and just drop it somewhere else. This element of globalization sometimes can actually work to the detriment of local culture. And so I guess it's important for us to try and find that happy medium, try to embrace modernization and globalization, technological advancement, but at the same time try to preserve local cultural identity.
I just want to step in here with a reminder that culture is not a static concept. It's a dynamic concept. If we have some static concept of culture, we'd be still stuck in the 6th century.
Yes.
So the reason why our environment keep changing is because, so therefore, you know, if you have a Venetian influence on X or Y, that's also culture.
Yes.
It's not like there is some pre-existing notion of culture that is the only culture. It's a completely dynamic concept.
So when Peggy speaks about trying to find what sort of constitutes the right mix, the ingredients for a livable city, what's the sort of process that you go through to try and enhance that user experience, the open spaces, whether it's film or culture or art? How do you go about doing that?
You're talking to me?
Yes.
So we list out 9 things when we talk about eco-livable cities. The first one is just new metrics and processes, so governance. 2 is transit-centered living, what some people call transit-oriented design, but I think that's just jargonish, but it's basically convenient access to services and social activities. Human-scaled streets, so walkability and things like that. Integration of nature, biophilia. The shared spaces, which everybody here I think is a mini expert on. But also distinct charm. So Knight Foundation, Soul of a City, really talked about access to social activities, charm, welcoming. So charm and welcoming. Regional cooperation. So between the different new cities, if everybody wants an international airport, you know, that's not really possible. Water is another example where we have to have regional cooperation. So what we're trying to do is basically give best practice examples from around the world of what livability looks like visually, so Chinese people can copy it, but put it into the Chinese characteristics. So how can we have livability with Chinese characteristics?
Can I take some questions from the audience? Do you have any questions? Oh, you are a shy bunch.
There's a question there.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, your name is?
Charbel from Schneider Electric. I heard the panel talk a lot about livability and culture. All is great. I haven't heard a single mention of efficiency. Because to me, if you want to finance all these great ideas, where do you get the money from? How do you deliver efficiency to invest in bigger, more sustainable ideas?
I think that's a good question for Reuben.
Well, I work for the largest infrastructure financier in South Asia, but it's just a very hard question to answer, actually, because we stay out of a lot of this urban stuff precisely for the reason that he mentioned, that you can't get the efficiency and so I don't know if I should be saying this publicly, but
oh, please, go ahead.
You're going to do it anyway.
You're in the living
yeah,
room.
but I'm going to do it anyways. I'm an academic. I can mouth off. So we're a publicly listed firm, and we were basically tasked with the job of financing infrastructure. And I'm actually now convinced that there is a conflict here between 30-year investments, 40-year investments, which are vital for the country, versus our responsibility, which is towards shareholders. And in that tension, the shareholder will always win. So therefore, if for any country that is looking to finance long-term infrastructure projects, 30, 40-year infrastructure projects, I'd probably recommend that they not be publicly listed and have some sort of unlisted entity doing some of this work. But beyond that, I mean, it's just a very hard question to answer. I don't really know.
You, sir, your name is?
Good morning. My name is Keon Hardeman. I'm the Miami City Commissioner, so I'm visiting you from Miami, Florida. And earlier you talked about in cities, safety is one thing that it's important, and it's part of the reason that we urbanize, because we want to have access to safety amongst some other things. And so in places, though, where we have a lot of urbanization, such as in the inner cities of places like Miami, you deal with a lot of poverty and you deal with a lot of crime. You spoke of Detroit and some of the issues that they had. In Miami, we have high wealth, but then we also have very poor people, and they clash. And it's not quite as bad as what you described earlier on the diagrams. However, it is something that we need to note. And so my question is to you, what are some strategies that you've seen that address crime and poverty? Because I believe that many times they go hand in hand.
Sure. I mean, look, I mean, I would put this at the center of the debate, which is how do you deal with fundamental rule of law kind of issues. So on the poverty side, I mean, ultimately, I look at cities as poverty reduction engines. Now, nobody's actually done the longitudinal research on this, but any family that migrates into a city after a certain point of time is most likely, at least 95% of the time, most likely to have been better off than they were when they entered the city. So I think, I certainly haven't seen academic research to back it up, but I think this is worthwhile longitudinal research to actually look at.
I think in China we have a lot of data.
Do you have the data? I mean, but is there academic work on this? Because cause and effect is very hard to tell, so you need to be able to do this on a fairly rigorous basis. Your second question about the safety and security, I think that goes back to what are first principles. You know, I mean, when you think about policing, for instance, you've got to ask yourself some fairly clear sort of first principles questions. So for instance, is the job of the police to prevent crime or respond to crime? And that's a first principle question. And how you respond to that first principle question will actually dictate your strategy. So for instance, if you look at Bill Bratton's strategy in New York, it was actually to prevent crime. And so therefore you will see a set of responses that flowed from that. Some people may agree with it, people may not agree with it. But you've got to start with first principles. I mean, in developing countries, you're actually starting with, say, a city like Bombay, which has had the same number of police 25 years ago that it has had today, in which time the population has gone from 10 million to 20 million. Right? I mean, we can't pretend like this is not important. It is extremely important. They never will get discussed at conferences like this. But this really matters. And the reason it typically doesn't get discussed is because we're typically, I mean, the middle class and the rich in these cities have exited the system. I've got private security. That's why it doesn't matter to me. But if you're poor, you don't have that luxury.
You know, China might be very different, but and it's not perfect, but I will say that it's interesting in that it doesn't have slums. There's a lot of poor people, and I find that there's maybe 2 or 3 things that are interesting. One is there's no food deserts, right? So even if you're very poor, or even, you know, I like to go around the corner and get a jinping, which is like a crepe, for maybe $1 US dollar. So there's a lot of availability of good food at cheap prices. Housing, so again, this isn't perfect, but China is building huge developments, so like maybe 10, 20 apartment blocks after apartment blocks for affordable housing. And all new affordable housing has to be 2 or 3 star, green rated. And then infrastructure for transportation, low carbon transport. So when I moved to Shanghai in 2004, we had 3 subway lines. Today we have 14, and soon we'll have 22. So it's very affordable for people to go very far distances and commute from Tianjin to Beijing for work each day. So again, not everybody is China, and China is not perfect, but I find that that does help not create the slums that you might see in other countries.
So I'm glad Peggy brought that up, but that's a bit that I didn't address, which is I think affordable housing is just as important to deal with the poverty issue.
One more question.
Why don't you just combine those 2 questions? gentleman here. And the
Yes,
lady there.
lady there.
Hello, I'm Prisca Weems. I'm here from the city of New Orleans on behalf of the mayor to learn from our friends in Jakarta. So I have a question for Tuty. It's very interesting to us that you have managed to blend public-private partnerships and bottom-up initiatives. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more on if you're doing these large-scale urban projects at different scales, actually large and small, how you've managed to deal with some of the issues around finance in the private sector to bring the richness out of these projects that really benefit the community at large.
We have a certain agency dealing with public partnership PPP scheme, and I think if you are interested in talking in more detail about our experience on managing PPP here in Jakarta, we have some example other than kids smart parks. We have also other PPP. For example, we built our social housing for poor people in Jakarta also using a PPP scheme. It is a kind of compensation from developers, which if they want to build in a certain area, then the compensation could be as a building could be building social housing for the poor. We have some building that build. We have social housing for poor people and also for low-cost housing here in Jakarta using PPP scheme. PPP scheme also implemented for example, for a reservoir for water retention at northern part of Jakarta. So I think we are now going onward to use PPP other than our local budget. And can I add some experience of Jakarta dealing with poor people? Here in Jakarta, for poor people, we have for about 3.5% of our total population, and we are provide scholarship, full scholarship for them until high school, and also full health insurance for them, and also provide social housing for them. And also we provide buses, school buses, special school buses for the poor people. So from that provision of infrastructure and also services, public services, we can avoid crime in Jakarta. We can lessen and also we can handle our criminality rate in Jakarta. Thank you.
Jason, I know our time is up, but I realized I forgot to mention one thing which is really important. I don't think it's probably going to be brought up for the rest of the summit. So China is going through this huge urbanization process. Again, we'll probably end up around 2030. But with One Belt, One Road, if you haven't heard of this initiative of regional cooperation to build infrastructure from Spain all the way to China to Kenya, I think that is going to be the manifestation of China's urbanization across that entire region. So I think that one interesting thing that this group should be discussing is how can China and AIIB work with other countries productively and environmentally consciously to urbanize all abroad. So how is that rail system, that nervous system going to expand urbanization from Kazakhstan to Kenya to Singapore to King's Cross to Madrid? Be very interesting.
Peggy, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would like to say thank you very much for the panelists. They're absolutely wonderful. Reuben Abraham, Tuty Kusumawati, Michel Crochon, Peggy Liu, thank you very much, and thank you.